Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, Part 5, Toronto, Chapter 27. There was a moment on Earth, improbable in retrospect and actually briefer than a moment in the span of human history, more like the blink of an eye, when it was possible to make a living solely by photographing and interviewing famous people. 7 years before the end of the world, Jeevan booked an interview with Arthur Leander. Jeevan had been working as a paparazzo for some years and had made a passable living at it, but he was sick to death of stalking celebrities from behind sidewalk planters and lying in wait in parked cars, so he was trying to become an entertainment journalist, which he felt was sleazy, but less sleazy than his current profession. I know this guy, he told an editor who'd bought a few of his photos in the past, when the subject of Arthur Leander came up over drinks. I've seen all his movies, some of them twice. I've stalked him all over town. I've photographed his wives. I can get him to talk to me. The editor agreed to give him a shot, so on the appointed day, Jeevan drove to a hotel and presented his ID and credentials to a young publicist stationed outside a penthouse suite. "You have 15 minutes," she said, and ushered him in. The suite was all parquet floors and bright lighting. There was a room with canapes on a table and a number of journalists staring at their phones, another room with Arthur in it. The man whom Jeevan believed to be the finest actor of his generation sat in an armchair by a window that looked out over downtown Los Angeles. Jeevan, who had an eye for expensive things, registered the weight of the drapes, the armchair's sleek fabric, the cut of Arthur's suit. There was no reason, Jeevan kept telling himself, why Arthur would know that Jeevan was the one who'd taken the photograph of Miranda. But of course there was. All he could think of was how stupid he'd been to tell Miranda his name that night. The whole entertainment journalist idea had been a mistake. It was obvious now. As he crossed the parquet floor, he entertained wild thoughts of faking a sudden illness and fleeing before Arthur looked up. But Arthur smiled and extended a hand when the publicist introduced them. Jeevan's name seemingly meant nothing to Arthur, and his face apparently didn't register either. Jeevan had taken pains to alter his appearance. He'd shaved off his sideburns. He'd taken out his contact lenses and was wearing glasses that he hoped made him look serious. He sat in the armchair across from Arthur and set his recorder on the coffee table between them. He had rewatched all of Arthur's movies over the previous 2 days and had done substantial additional research. But Arthur didn't want to talk about the movie he was shooting or his training or influences or what drove him as an artist or whether he still saw himself as an outsider, as he'd said in one of his first interviews some years back. He responded in monosyllables to Jeevan's first 3 questions. He seemed dazed and hungover. He looked like he hadn't slept well in some time. "So tell me," he said, after what seemed to Jeevan to be an uncomfortably long silence. His publicist had deposited an emergency cappuccino into his hands a moment earlier. "How does a person become an entertainment journalist?" "Is this one of those postmodern things?" Jeevan asked, "where you turn the tables and interview me like those celebrities who take photos of the paparazzi?" Careful, he thought. His disappointment at Arthur's disinterest in talking to him was curdling into hostility, and beneath that lurked a number of larger questions of the kind that kept him up at night. Interviewing actors was better than stalking them, but what kind of journalism career was this? What kind of life? Some people managed to do things that actually mattered. Some people, his brother Frank, for example, were currently covering the war in Afghanistan for Reuters. Jeevan didn't specifically want to be Frank, but he couldn't help but feel that he'd made a number of wrong turns in comparison. "I don't know," Arthur said. "I'm just curious. How do you get into this line of work? Gradually, and then suddenly." The actor frowned as if trying to remember something. "Gradually, and then suddenly," he repeated. He was quiet for a moment. "No, seriously," he said, snapping out of it. "I've always wondered what drives you people." "Money, generally speaking." "Sure, but aren't there easier jobs? This whole entertainment journalism thing. I mean, look, I'm not saying a guy like you has to be the same as the paparazzi." "Thank you for paying so little attention," Jeevan thought. "I know what you do isn't the same thing as what they do, but I've seen guys—" Arthur held up a hand hold that thought, and swallowed half of his cappuccino. The infusion of the caffeine made his eyes widen slightly. I've seen guys climb trees, he said. I'm not kidding. This was during my divorce, around the time Miranda moved out. I'm washing the dishes. I look out the window, and there's this guy balancing up there with a camera. You wash dishes? Yeah, the housekeeper was talking to the press, so I fired her, and then the dishwasher broke. Never rains, but it pours, right? Arthur grinned. I like you, he said. Jeevan smiled, embarrassed by how flattered he was by this. It's an interesting line of work, he said. One meets some interesting people. One also meets some of the most boring people on the face of the earth, but he thought a little flattery couldn't hurt. I've always been interested in people, Arthur said. What drives them? What moves them? That kind of thing. Jeevan searched his face for some sign of sarcasm, but he seemed utterly sincere. Me too, actually. I'm just asking because you don't seem like most of the others. I don't? Really? I mean, did you always want to be an entertainment guy? I used to be a photographer. What kind of photography? Arthur was finishing his cappuccino. Weddings and portraits. And you went from that to writing about people like me? Yes, Jeevan said, I did. Why would you? I was sick of going to weddings. The pay was better. It was less of a hassle. Why do you ask? Arthur reached across the table and turned off Jeevan's tape recorder. Do you know how tired I am of talking about myself? You do give a lot of interviews. Too many. Don't write that I said that. It was easier when it was just theater and TV work, the occasional profile or feature interview or whatever. But you get successful in the movies, and Christ, it's like a whole other thing. He raised his cup in a cappuccino signaling motion, and Jeevan heard the publicist's heels clicking away on the floor behind him. Sorry, he said. I know it's a little disingenuous to complain about a job like mine. You have no idea, Jeevan thought. You're rich, and you'll always be rich, and if you wanted to, you could stop working today and never work again. But you've been doing movies for years, he said, in his most neutral tone. Yeah, Arthur said. I think I'm still not used to it. It's still somehow embarrassing, all the attention. I tell people I don't notice the paparazzi anymore, but I do. I just can't look at them. Which I appreciate, Jeevan thought. He was aware that his 15-minute allotment was trickling away. He held up the recorder so Arthur would notice it, pressed the record button, and sat on the coffee table between them. You've had considerable success, Jeevan said, and with that comes, of course, a certain loss of privacy. Is it fair to say that you find the scrutiny difficult? Arthur sighed. He clasped his hands together, and Jeevan had an impression that he was gathering his strength. You know, Arthur said clearly and brightly, playing a new devil-may-care individual who wouldn't sound in the playback like he was pale and obviously sleep-deprived with dark circles under his eyes. I just figure that's part of the deal, you know. We're so lucky to be in this position, all of us who make our living as actors, and I find complaints about invasion of privacy to be disingenuous, frankly. I mean, let's be real here. We wanted to be famous, right? It wasn't like we didn't know what we'd be facing going in. The speech seemed to take something out of him. He wilted visibly and accepted a new cappuccino from his publicist with a nod of thanks. An awkward silence ensued. So you just flew in from Chicago, Jeevan said, at a loss. Yes, I did. Arthur reached and turned off Jeevan's recorder again. Tell me something, he said. What did you say your name was? Jeevan Chowdhury. If I tell you something, Jeevan Chowdhury, how long do I have before it appears in print? Well, Jeevan said, what do you want to tell me? Something no one else knows, but I want 24 hours before it appears anywhere. Arthur, the publicist said from somewhere behind Jeevan, we live in the information age. It'll be on TMZ before he gets to the parking lot. I'm a man of my word, Jeevan said. At that point in his directionless life, he wasn't sure if this was true or not, but it was a nice thing. It was nice to think that it might be. What does that mean? Arthur asked. It means I do what I say I'm going to do. Okay, look, Arthur said, if I tell you something, guaranteed exclusive? Yes, I'll tell no one else on condition that you give me 24 hours. Fine, Jeevan said. I could give you 24 hours until it runs. Not just until it runs, 24 hours until you tell another living soul, because I don't want some intern at wherever the hell you work, leaking it themselves. Okay, Jeevan said, 24 hours before I tell another living soul. He was pleased by the intrigue. Arthur, the publicist said, could I speak with you for a moment? No, Arthur said, I have to do this. You don't have to do anything, she said. Remember who you're talking to. I'm a man of my word, Jeevan repeated. This sounded a little sillier the second time. You're a journalist, she said. Don't be ridiculous. Arthur? Okay, look, Arthur said to Jeevan. I came here directly from the airport, okay? I came here 2 hours early, almost 3 hours actually, because I didn't want to go home first. Why didn't... I'm leaving my wife for Lydia Marks, Arthur said. Oh my God, the publicist said. Lydia Marks was Arthur's co-star in the film that had just wrapped in Chicago. Jeevan had photographed her coming out of a club once in Los Angeles, bright-eyed and almost supernaturally put together at 3 a.m. She was the sort of person who liked the paparazzi and sometimes actually called them in advance. She'd flashed him a winning smile. You're leaving Elizabeth Colton, Jeevan said. Why? Because I have to. I'm in love with someone else. Why are you telling me this? I'm moving in with Lydia next month, he said, and Elizabeth doesn't know it yet. I flew here a week ago when I had a day off from filming specifically to tell her, and I just couldn't do it. Look, here's what you have to understand about Elizabeth. Nothing bad has ever happened to her. Nothing? Don't write that in your piece. I shouldn't have mentioned it. The point is, I haven't been able to tell her. I couldn't do it in any of the times we spoke on the phone, and I couldn't do it today. But if you tell me that this story will appear tomorrow, then that forces my hand, doesn't it? It'll be a sensitive story, Jeevan said. You and Elizabeth are still friends, and you wish only the best for her, and you have no further comment, and you desire for her privacy to be respected at this difficult time. That about it? Arthur sighed. He looked somewhat older than 44. Can you say it was mutual for her sake? The split was mutual and amicable, Jeevan said. You and Elizabeth remain friends. You have considerable respect for one another and have decided mutually that it's best for you to go your separate ways, and you wish for privacy in this, I don't know, in this difficult time. That's perfect. Do you want me to mention Jeevan didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. Arthur winced and looked at the ceiling. Yes, he said in a strained voice, let's mention the baby. Why not? Your first priority is your son, Tyler, who you and Elizabeth are committed to co-parenting. I'll make it less awkward than that. Thank you, Arthur said.